War has always been a part of human history, but not all conflicts are remembered for glory and honor. Some battles stand out for their sheer cruelty and violence. The Romans, who built an empire with blood and slavery, the Assyrians, notorious for skinning their enemies alive, and the Vikings, feared for their merciless raids on helpless monasteries. Each left a legacy of terror. In this video, we'll uncover the shocking tales of bloodshed, betrayal, and violence, revealing the darkest facets of human nature and the true price of war. Number 12. Sack of Jerusalem. What kind of devastation turns a city into a graveyard, its streets filled with blood, and leaves an entire culture reeling from the loss? In 70 AD, one of the most brutal events in ancient history unfolded with the Roman siege and eventual sack of Jerusalem. This marked the climax of the First Jewish-Roman War, a long and bitter conflict sparked by a Jewish rebellion against Roman rule. The Romans, led by General Titus, were determined to crush the resistance and make an example out of Jerusalem, and their actions left the city in ruins and its people devastated. The siege began when Roman forces surrounded the city, cutting off all supply routes. With about 60,000 soldiers, the Romans built a wall around Jerusalem to ensure no food or water could get in, intending to starve the defenders into submission. Inside the city, the situation grew desperate. Hunger and disease spread quickly, weakening the Jewish resistance. Despite their dire situation, the defenders refused to give up, fighting fiercely against the Roman onslaught. After several months of brutal fighting, the Romans managed to break through the city's outer defenses. What followed was a merciless assault, as Roman soldiers advanced street by street, killing anyone who stood in their way. Thousands of Jewish fighters and civilians were slaughtered, and those who tried to flee the city were either captured or killed. The streets were filled with chaos, bloodshed, and cries for mercy that went unanswered. The most devastating moment of the siege came with the destruction of the Second Temple, a site that held deep religious and cultural significance for the Jewish people. The temple wasn't just a place of worship, it was the heart of their faith and community. When Roman forces set it ablaze, the fire consumed not only the structure, but also the hopes and spirit of the people. Precious artifacts were looted, and the temple's destruction became a symbol of total defeat. The aftermath was equally grim. Roman soldiers continued their rampage, massacring civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. Historical accounts estimate that over 1 million people died during the siege, succumbing to violence, starvation, or disease. Those who survived faced a bleak future. About 97,000 were captured and sold into slavery, scattered across the Roman Empire. Many were forced into hard labor, while others were paraded as trophies during Titus's victory celebrations. Just as the Romans crushed Jerusalem with merciless force, another tragic episode of ancient warfare unfolded where the entire system of the country depended on their slaves. Number 11. The Massacre of the Helots. The Helots were an enslaved population primarily made up of people from the region of Messenia, whom the Spartans had conquered centuries earlier. Unlike other forms of slavery in ancient Greece, the Helots were not owned by individual Spartans, but by the Spartan state itself. This unique arrangement meant that the Helots formed the backbone of Spartan society, providing agricultural labor and freeing Spartan citizens to focus on military training. However, this system was maintained through extreme violence and fear, including the regular practice of the systematic massacre of Helots. Spartan society was built around a culture of military dominance, and the Spartans lived in constant fear of a Helot rebellion. The Helots greatly outnumbered the Spartan citizens, which created a volatile situation. To prevent uprisings, the Spartans employed harsh measures to keep the Helots in check. One of the most infamous practices was the annual declaration of war on the Helots by the Spartan government, which allowed any Spartan to kill a Helot without fear of punishment. This was part of a formal system of terror that ensured the Helots remained submissive. The most extreme example of this systematic oppression was the Crypteia. The Crypteia was a secret police force made up of young Spartan men who, as part of their training, were sent out at night to hunt and kill any Helots they deemed a threat. This practice wasn't just a way to eliminate potential leaders of Helot revolts, it was also a means of psychological control. By making Helots live in constant fear of arbitrary execution, the Spartans ensured that they remained subdued. The reasons behind this extreme violence were both social and economic. Helots worked the land and produced the food that sustained Spartan society, making them essential to the Spartan way of life. Spartans themselves were forbidden from engaging in trade or manual labor because their entire system relied on the exploitation of the Helots. This dependency, however, also made the Spartans deeply insecure. The fear of rebellion was ever present, and the Spartans believed that only through violence and terror could they maintain control over such a large population. Economically, the Helots' labor allowed the Spartans to focus entirely on military matters, which was central to Spartan identity and power. The relationship between Spartans and Helots was, therefore, a vicious cycle of dependency and fear. The Spartans needed the Helots to maintain their military dominance, but their fear of rebellion led them to employ increasingly brutal measures to keep the Helots subjugated. From the brutal measures of Sparta, we move to the sweeping ambitions of a conqueror who wouldn't show 2,000 surviving men mercy. Number 10. Conquests of Alexander the Great. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great faced one of his toughest challenges during his campaign through the Persian Empire, the island city of Tyre. Tyre wasn't just any city, it was a wealthy, fortified stronghold known as the Queen of the Seas, sitting off the coast of what is now Lebanon. For centuries, Tyre had resisted attackers with its strong walls and powerful navy, but when its leaders refused to surrender to Alexander, they made a decision that would lead to one of the most intense and brutal moments in ancient history. Alexander wasn't someone who gave up easily. When he saw that he couldn't take Tyre by sea, he came up with a bold, almost unbelievable plan. Instead of trying to break through the city's defenses by water, he ordered his men to build a massive land bridge connecting the mainland to the island. This wasn't just some small project. It took months of hard labor, with constant attacks from the Tyrians trying to stop them. But Alexander's forces kept at it. They worked day and night, piling up stones, dirt, and whatever they could find to create it. Once they reached Tyre's walls, the real nightmare for the city began. Alexander's forces launched a ferocious assault, eventually breaking through Tyre's defenses. What followed was pure devastation. Over 6,000 Tyrians were killed in the fighting. Alexander wasn't done, though. Around 2,000 surviving men were taken and crucified along the shore. This wasn't just revenge, it was a message. Alexander wanted the rest of the world to see what happened when a city defied him. Historian Quintus Curtius Rufus wrote that these brutal executions were meant to strike fear into the hearts of other cities, showing them the fate that awaited those who resisted. But the horror didn't stop there. The remaining 30,000 inhabitants of Tyre, mostly women and children, were sold into slavery. Tyre wasn't the only city that felt Alexander's wrath. While its rulers had already been defeated, Alexander's destructive path continued in cities that had already submitted, leaving a trail of unnecessary suffering. Number 9. Destruction of Persepolis. The destruction of Persepolis in 330 BC was one of the most dramatic moments in Alexander the Great's conquest of the Persian Empire. Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, was a city of immense wealth and grandeur. It symbolized the heart of the Persian Empire and was a center for royal ceremonies and Persian culture. When Alexander and his army arrived in the city after defeating the Persian king Darius III, they took control of its vast treasures and established their dominance over the Persian heartland. Despite its splendor, Persepolis was not spared from destruction. A few months after Alexander's occupation, the city was set on fire and its palaces were reduced to ruins. The exact reason for the burning has been debated by historians for centuries. Some argue it was an intentional act of revenge, while others suggest it might have been an accident that got out of control. One theory is that Alexander ordered the destruction as a symbolic act of retribution for the Persian invasion of Greece over a century earlier, during which Persian forces had burned parts of Athens, including the Acropolis. By burning Persepolis, Alexander may have wanted to send a clear message to the Persians that their empire had fallen, and now it was Greece's turn to assert dominance. Another explanation is that the fire was not premeditated, but the result of a wild night of celebration. According to ancient sources like Plutarch, during a drunken banquet, an Athenian woman named Thais encouraged Alexander to burn the city in a show of vengeance for the destruction of Athens. Fueled by alcohol and the excitement of victory, Alexander reportedly agreed, and the fire was set, quickly spreading through the wooden structures of the city. Much like the fiery destruction of Persepolis at the hands of Alexander the Great, another ancient city met a brutal end at the hands of an empire determined to erase its rival from existence. Number 8. Siege of Carthage. Carthage, once a bustling city along the North African coast, had long stood as Rome's fiercest rival. For years they had clashed across the Mediterranean, locked in a bitter struggle for power. But by the time the Third Punic War, 149–146 BCE, rolled around, Rome had made up its mind. Carthage had to go, and go for good. Led by the fiery politician Cato the Elder, the Romans launched their final attack with a clear mission: total destruction. Cato's words, "Carthago delenda est," which meant Carthage must be destroyed, echoed like a death sentence. After a grueling 3-year siege, the Romans finally broke through Carthage's defenses in 146 BCE. What happened next was nothing short of a nightmare. Roman soldiers flooded the city, killing anyone in their path. Hundreds of thousands of Carthaginians were massacred. Out of the 700,000 people living in the city before the siege, only 50,000 survived, and they were dragged into slavery, scattered across the vast Roman Empire. The city itself was reduced to rubble. Polybius, an ancient historian who witnessed the aftermath, was haunted by what he saw. The once proud city was now a wasteland of ashes and corpses. Streets that had once been alive with trade and culture were now littered with the dead. Appian, another historian, later wrote about the Romans' cruelty in chilling detail. The last defenders, many of them unarmed civilians, were butchered where they stood. Men, women, children, the elderly, no one was spared. After the annihilation of Carthage, Rome's hunger for domination continued unabated, and it soon turned its gaze to Greece. Number 7. Sack of Corinth. In 146 BCE, Corinth was a proud and wealthy Greek city-state, but its story took a violent turn when it found itself on the wrong side of the Roman Republic. The conflict between Rome and Corinth was part of a larger struggle known as the Achaean War, which erupted because many Greek cities, including Corinth, were unhappy with growing Roman influence in Greece. Tensions had been rising for some time, and Corinth's defiance of Rome finally brought matters to a head. Rome sent its army under the command of General Lucius Mummius to deal with the rebellious Greek cities. The Roman forces were well-trained, disciplined, and far larger than anything the Greek city-states could muster. When they reached Corinth, the city's leaders tried to hold their ground, but they were severely outmatched. In a brief but brutal battle, the Roman legions crushed Corinth's defenders. The city's walls were breached, and what followed was one of the most devastating events in ancient Greek history. After the battle, the Romans unleashed their wrath on Corinth. The entire city was sacked, and the destruction was absolute. Thousands of Corinth's citizens were slaughtered. Roman soldiers showed no mercy, killing men, women, and children alike. The slaughter wasn't just about winning a battle, it was a clear message to the rest of Greece that defying Rome would have deadly consequences. But the violence didn't stop there. After the killing, the Romans looted the city. Corinth had been famous for its wealth and beautiful artwork, and the Roman soldiers took everything of value they could find. Statues, paintings, and treasures were stripped from the city, much of it shipped back to Rome as spoils of war. What couldn't be taken was destroyed. Once the looting was over, Mummius gave the order to burn the city to the ground. Buildings that had stood for centuries were reduced to ashes. The great temples, marketplaces, and homes were all destroyed, leaving nothing but ruins where a thriving city had once stood. The few survivors, those who hadn't been killed during the sack, faced a grim fate. Many were sold into slavery and scattered throughout the Roman Empire. Families were torn apart, and Corinth's population, once thriving, was decimated. While Corinth's destruction marked a brutal turning point in Roman expansion, centuries earlier, another legendary conflict played out at the narrow pass of Thermopylae. Number 6. The slaughter at Thermopylae. In 480 BC, a small coalition of Greek forces, led by King Leonidas of Sparta, made a legendary stand against the massive Persian army of Xerxes. For 3 days, the Greeks held the pass, using the terrain to their advantage. Their goal was to delay the Persians and allow the rest of Greece time to prepare for the invasion. However, the tides turned when a Greek traitor, Helots, revealed a hidden mountain path to the Persians, allowing them to outflank the Greek forces. With the Persians closing in from both sides, Leonidas dismissed most of the Greek soldiers, but a small group of Spartans, Thespians, and Thebans chose to stay and fight to the end. They knew they would not survive, but wanted to hold off the enemy for as long as possible. The final stand was fierce, but brief. Overwhelmed and surrounded, the remaining defenders were slaughtered by the Persian forces. King Xerxes, angered by the unexpected resistance and the loss of many of his own soldiers, ordered that the body of Leonidas be beheaded and crucified, an act of vengeance meant to demonstrate Persian superiority. The Persians, known for their harsh punishments, made sure that no Greek fighters would leave the battlefield alive. Before we continue, here's today's subscriber's pick. Take a moment to examine this image. It's bound to spark some curiosity. In ancient times, conquering a city meant claiming everything within it. as seen with the Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan's expansion was marked by brutal tactics, particularly against those who resisted. He famously declared that those who surrendered would be spared, but those who fought back would be destroyed, along with their families. Mass executions were common for defying Mongol forces. Despite laws meant to protect women from rape and enslavement, Khan still used sexual violence as a weapon of war. Women were chosen for their beauty and added to his harem, while others were given to his commanders and sons. Today, about 0.5% of the world's male population can trace their lineage back to Khan, a grim reminder of the scale of his conquests and the suffering endured by women under his empire. Number 5. Ruthless raids and destruction by the Vikings. Long before the Roman legions razed Corinth or the Persians overwhelmed Leonidas at Thermopylae, a different kind of terror swept across Europe during the Viking Age. This era, stretching from the late 700s to the early 1000s, is often celebrated for the Norsemen's adventures on the seas. But there's a darker side to their story, one marked by brutal raids and destruction. While these seafaring warriors were skilled traders and explorers, they were also feared for the devastation they brought wherever they landed. One of the most infamous Viking attacks happened in 793 CE, when they stormed the monastery at Lindisfarne in England. It was a bloodbath. Monks were slaughtered, treasures stolen, and sacred buildings set ablaze. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls it a great slaughter, and it's easy to see why. But this was just the beginning. For centuries, Viking raids terrorized the coasts of England, Ireland, and France. Their attacks were swift and brutal, catching villages off guard. No one was safe. Some towns were wiped out completely, with survivors either taken as slaves or left behind to rebuild from the ashes. For the Vikings, it wasn't just about treasure. It was about power, fear, and domination. Much like the Vikings' terrifying raids across Europe, where terror and devastation left permanent scars, the ruthless military campaigns of Julius Caesar also reshaped the landscape of Europe, but through conquest and domination. Number 4. The Conquest of Gaul by Julius Caesar. This campaign not only expanded the boundaries of the Roman Republic, but also showcased the ruthless nature of Roman warfare. Caesar's campaign led to the destruction of numerous Gallic tribes and the enslavement of vast numbers of people, leaving a lasting impact on the region and shaping the future of Europe. At the time of Caesar's campaign, Gaul was a land divided among various tribes, each with its own leadership and culture. Unlike a unified state, these tribes often had conflicting interests, making them vulnerable to Roman intervention. Caesar, then serving as the governor of several Roman provinces near Gaul, saw an opportunity for personal and political gain. Officially, he justified his actions by claiming to protect Rome's allies in the region. In reality, his goal was to dominate Gaul entirely and cement his own authority. Throughout his campaigns, Caesar employed a combination of military might and strategic diplomacy to overpower the Gallic tribes. In his famous account, Commentari de Bello Gallico, which translates to Commentaries on the Gallic War, Caesar detailed his victories and military strategies. The work, while an important historical document, also served as propaganda to promote his achievements and justify the extreme measures taken during the conquest. In several instances, entire tribes were decimated, either killed in battle or massacred after surrendering. One of the most notorious examples of this was the fate of the Eburones tribe, who were almost entirely wiped out after a rebellion against Roman forces. Those who survived the conquests often faced slavery, with tens of thousands of Gauls sold into servitude. This brutal treatment ensured that resistance against Roman rule was crushed, but it also spread fear across the region. Despite the devastation, Caesar's conquest of Gaul brought vast wealth and resources to Rome. Gaul became a crucial part of the Roman Empire, contributing significantly to its economy and military strength. The campaign also greatly enhanced Caesar's reputation, both as a military commander and as a political figure, helping him gain the influence that would eventually lead to his rise as dictator of Rome. Just as Julius Caesar's ruthless campaign in Gaul reshaped the future of Europe and expanded Roman influence, another brutal episode from antiquity highlights the harsh realities of war and power. Number 3. Massacre of Melos. The Massacre of Melos took place in 416 BC during the Peloponnesian War, a conflict between Athens and Sparta that spanned nearly 3 decades. Melos was a small island in the Aegean Sea, neutral in the war but leaning towards Sparta due to its Dorian heritage. Athens, seeking to expand its influence and punish any city that might support Sparta, demanded Melos submit to Athenian rule and pay tribute. The Melians refused, hoping their neutrality and ties with Sparta would protect them. Athens saw this defiance as a threat and a challenge to its authority. They sent a powerful fleet and army to the island to force the Melians into submission. Before the attack, Athenian representatives met with the Melian leaders in what has become known as the Melian Dialogue, famously recorded by the historian Thucydides. In this discussion, the Athenians made it clear that the strong have the right to rule the weak, and that the Melians should surrender to avoid destruction. The Melians argued that they had a right to remain neutral and trusted that either the gods or their Spartan allies would come to their aid. The Athenians, however, were not swayed. When the Melians continued to resist, the Athenians laid siege to the city. Eventually, after a lengthy blockade, the Melians were forced to surrender due to starvation and the overwhelming strength of the Athenian forces. What followed was brutal. The Athenians executed all the male citizens of Melos. Women and children were taken as slaves. Following the brutal subjugation of Melos by the Athenians, another catastrophic event in ancient history unfolded, this time at the height of Alexander the Great's conquests. Number 2. Massacre at Cyrene. After witnessing how the Spartans maintained control over the Helots through fear and violence, we turn to another instance of brutal domination, this time under Roman rule in Cyrene. Cyrene was a Greek city located in what is now modern-day Libya, and during ancient times it was a prosperous place known for its trade and culture. It had been a Greek colony, but by 96 BCE it had come under Roman control. The Romans had a governor named Lucius Cornelius Lentulus Crusader overseeing the region. Cyrene's people were not pleased with Roman rule, and tensions were brewing. Things boiled over when a group of locals rebelled against the heavy taxes and the strict control the Romans had over the city. They didn't like being ruled by foreigners, and the city was full of unrest. The governor, Lentulus, decided to take swift and harsh action. Instead of negotiating or calming the situation, he responded with brutal force. Lentulus sent in Roman soldiers to crush the rebellion. The Romans stormed the city, and the result was a massacre. Men, women, and children were killed without mercy. Entire families were wiped out, and the streets were left covered in blood. It wasn't just about punishing the rebels, it was a complete show of Roman power. The goal was to strike fear into anyone else who might think about rising up against the Roman authorities. Not only did the soldiers kill many people, but they also looted the city. Homes were ransacked and valuable items were stolen. The city's wealth was stripped away, leaving Cyrene in ruins. The destruction wasn't just physical. Roman soldiers made sure that the people of Cyrene were broken and terrified too. Number 1. The Massacre at Miletus. Following the brutal suppression of rebellion in Cyrene, another city across the Mediterranean faced a similar fate at the hands of a powerful empire. In 494 BCE, the Greek city of Miletus, a once thriving center of wealth and philosophy, became the last stronghold of the Ionian revolt against Persian rule. This conflict started because the city had become part of the Ionian revolt. The Ionian revolt began in 491 BCE when several Greek city-states under Persian rule rebelled against their overlords. Miletus, being one of the key cities of Ionia, played a leading role in the uprising. The Greeks, frustrated by Persian control and high taxes, sought to break free. Initially, they even had some success and managed to gain support from Athens. However, the Persians, led by King Darius I, were determined to crush the rebellion and teach the Greeks a harsh lesson. The Persians launched a massive campaign to bring the rebellious cities back under control. After a series of battles, the Greeks began to lose ground, and Miletus became the last major city standing in the revolt. In 4994 BCE, the Persian forces laid siege to Miletus. The city had prepared as best it could, but the Persian army was far superior in numbers and strength. After months of siege, the Persian forces finally broke through the city's defenses, and what followed was a massacre that left a deep scar on the city and the Greek world. Once the Persian soldiers entered the city, they slaughtered much of the population. The streets of Miletus ran red with the blood of its citizens. The Persian army showed no mercy, and countless men, women, and children were killed. For the Persians, this was not just a military victory, it was an act of terror meant to serve as a warning to other Greek cities about the consequences of rebellion. Those who survived the slaughter didn't escape suffering. Many of the surviving women and children were captured and sold into slavery, while others were forced into exile. Miletus, once a thriving and powerful city, was reduced to ruins. The Persians razed much of the city, destroying its walls, buildings, and temples. The Greeks were horrified by the massacre. The destruction of Miletus became a symbol of Persian cruelty and power. In Athens, a playwright named Phrynichus even wrote a tragedy about the fall of Miletus called The Sack of Miletus. The play was so moving and heartbreaking that the audience broke down in tears, and Phrynichus was fined for reminding the people of such a painful event. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in our next video.